Welcome to TIDES. I'm your host, Shveta Malhan. And if you joined us last time, you've heard Malvika Jethmalani share her powerful journey as a 3-time CHRO and a founder of the Atvis Group, someone who's helped shape HR transformation across industries and continents. And today we are continuing that conversation with a focus on something that's becoming mission critical in HR: people data. How can HR move from reports to insights, from supporting decisions to driving them? And what does it take to become not just storytellers, but the strategists and speak the language of the boardroom? So let's dive into that conversation. Malvika, welcome to Tides.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
I'm so excited that we are continuing this conversation, Malvika, because last time when we were chatting, we just scratched the surface on the people data dimension of things. So today, let's just do a deeper dive into what does people data mean for an HR team and your perspective on why is people data important or mission critical from a CHRO's lens.
I think every decision we make in business now is based on some kind of data, right? And we are surrounded by data, especially in this age of AI. Everything that we do, from how we acquire customers to how we keep and retain customers to how we scale the business, everything is based on data-backed recommendations from typically the executive team. And so I think the same needs to be true in HR. I think how we acquire talent, how we retain talent, how we grow and develop people, including how we offboard people and manage our employer brand from the onboarding to the offboarding journey, and everything in between needs to be informed by data, because that is the world we live in. And as a senior HR leader, if you want to earn the trust and credibility with the CEO, as well as with the board and the investors, I think this is a non-negotiable.
So for our audience, so that we can close a little bit of the imagination gap around what do we mean by presenting ourselves differently in the boardroom, because data could also mean just reports and dashboards. So from your lived experience, how have you used people data in your career in the past, which has helped shift the conversation at the executive table from HR being viewed as a support function to HR being viewed as a value driver? Can you pull something from your lived experience so that we can help with a tangible example for our audience?
Absolutely, yes. I'm so glad you asked this question. So I'll give you kind of a real world example. So in one of my roles, what we did is we layered the attrition data with exit interviews, team engagement scores, even the data that we gathered from skip level meetings and AMAs and manager effectiveness ratings. And this wasn't just, people are leaving. It was the why, it was the so what behind that data, including what is it costing us. And we found that the turnover in one business unit was affecting our ability to retain customers. And when we quantified it, this was a $4.5 million problem, $4.5 million per year annually. And so we got executive team buy-in to make some changes that we needed to make, which cost way less than $4.5 million. And we were able to drastically improve in fact, we improved the turnover by more than 50% on that team. Because it was so high. And I think that was a great example of a situation where we reframed HR from being a cost center to kind of a force multiplier, as you said. And I think, so many of us get caught in this kind of dashboard mindset of just throwing up dashboards. And I think data earns you a seat at the table, but the interpretation of the data and the storytelling earns you the influence. So if you think about finance teams, if finance teams are telling a story about margin and a customer acquisition versus customer lifetime value data, then HR needs to be able to tell a story about what it's costing us to acquire talent versus what it's costing us to retain and engage talent velocity, engagement, readiness, and tying all of that back to the business metrics.
Absolutely. Connecting, correlating, and telling the story and sharing insights become becomes more important for the executives and decision makers versus here's my head count and here's how it's been trending for last 3 years. I completely hear you. At the same time, people analytics as a capability is still relatively new in the HR function. For the longest time, organizations have spent so much time, energy, effort, technology, and infrastructure to understand their customers to the nth degree. But I don't think we understand our employees to the same degree. So, is people analytics an easy capability to lift in an organization?
So is it an easy capability to build? I don't think so. And I don't think it has to do with actually building the function and hiring the people. I think, at least in my experience, so much of the issue that I've observed is with a lack of data or lack of clean data. So often, in many of my roles, I've spent months just cleaning up HR data because you don't have the data that you need available to you. And sometimes, if you are a CHRO in a small to medium sized business, you might actually be taking over the HR function and building it from the ground up for the first time. And you might be taking it over from finance or operations or legal. So because they were wearing, multiple hats, they might not have had the time or the skills or the knowledge to have clean data and clean dashboards or to install data governance practices. So I feel like that is probably the hardest part of building people analytics capabilities.
But I'm also very curious when you talk about data governance as it relates to people data. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean and what does that look like for people who are new on this journey of lifting people analytics capability in their organization?
Absolutely. So what I mean by that is once you kind of have your data house in order, it needs to be maintained, right? It's like if you clean your house one time, it's not going to stay clean. All
Yeah.
right, you need to change the sheets, you need to vacuum, etc. It's the same thing with your data house. So conducting regular data audits, and by the way, so much of this can be automated now. So conducting regular data audits to make sure that you're catching inconsistencies before they become systemic problems. Conducting audits helps you make sure that your data remains accurate, that it's complete, it's compliant with evolving regulations. There's so many new regulations now, whether it's GDPR and the EU AI Act in Europe or the California Privacy Act. I'm sure now with how things are going, at least in the United States, we might start to see even state level AI regulation and more fragmented AI regulation. So when you have your data in order, it becomes so much easier and so much faster to make sure that you are compliant with all of these different types of regulations. And I think the other thing I will say is it's really, really important for HR leaders to stay up to date and current on global data privacy laws and making sure that your internal policies and external vendor practices are compliant with these regulations. We all know the consequences of non-compliance. Obviously, you have financial damage, but I think the bigger damage can be reputational damage and damage to your employer brand. So I think beyond compliance, data governance is about building trust. Your employees need to be able to trust that you're going to handle their data appropriately. Your board needs to be able to trust that when you present data to them, that it's accurate and consistent, and it's going to continue to remain accurate. And so I think a lot of it comes down to the HR function positioning itself as stewards of people analytics and stewards of data privacy and security when it comes to employee data as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. And is this data governance like a separate team that sits outside of HR? Is it in HR? Is it cross functional? How do we establish that governance team?
Yeah, so typically what I've done is this responsibility sits with the people analytics team. Ultimately, the person who's accountable is the CHRO. So historically, it's been me. But you have the responsibility sit with the people analytics team, but you need to partner very, very closely with general counsel, and or your CISO or chief privacy officer, if that role is separate from the legal team. And because those individuals or teams will have the deep expertise on regulation and evolving regulation as well. So I think the responsibility for employee data governance should sit with people analytics, but you need a very, very close partnership with people in legal, privacy, and data security.
And I wanted to call this out specifically because the day and age that we live in, like every organization is a data organization, whether they are tapping into their data intentionally or not. There's immense amount of data that's floating in the organization. And here, when we are talking about data, we're not just talking about the explicit data where you capture employment details, address, payroll, like all of that is explicit data, which is called out. There's a tons of data around digital footprint of employees as well. Who are they talking to? How often? Like so much is implicit and hidden. That data is also being captured. And how do you handle that data? And which speaks to the trust with the employees too. Nobody likes to be monitored or feel like they are under a big brother watch kind of a scenario as well. So data is a much wider conversation today than maybe 10 years ago when we were thinking about people data.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you called that out. People Slack conversations, that's data. I know some companies have been, it's a very highly controversial practice. Some companies have been tracking people's badge swipes, right? When do you come into the office versus when do you leave? That's employee data as well. So absolutely, it's the bigger umbrella.
Yeah, yeah. And the stronger governance we have, the more transparent also we can be with our employees and let them know what parts of their digital identity are we actually tapping into and to make what decisions and choices as well, so that goes a long way. All right, that's great. I've also noticed that sometimes there's tension between what the data says and what your gut tells you. So when we are going as HR leaders to present a story or an insight, how do we balance that judgment that comes through instinct and lived experience versus what the data is telling us?
So I think I told you on our first call or our first recording that I started my career in accounting and finance, and then I moved into HR. So because of my background and training, I have an extremely strong tendency toward using data to make recommendations and decisions. And this is something that I got feedback on. CEO told me that all your recommendations are backed by data and super solid, but sometimes you also need to come with your instinct because you have a lot of experience in this area and you have deep experience. And I want to know, what is your instinct telling you? And so I think it's really, really important to strike a balance. So I have started to, whenever I'm, in a boardroom or with a CEO or executive team, not just presenting the data, but layering on top of that my experience, my lived experience from many, many different types of organizations. Because as you gain experience, you start to recognize patterns, and you typically know, with 80-90% confidence sometimes what's going on just from looking at the patterns. And I've also encountered situations where I've observed what's happening in the organization and I know what the problem is, but I know that if I go and try to gather the data, it's going to take me several months. So I actually had a situation where I was very open with a CEO and the HR committee of the board where I said, look, I can spend 6 months gathering the data, or I can tell you that based on my experience, the patterns that I'm seeing are telling me this. And based on this, I think the problem is X, Y, and Z. And when you have X, Y, and Z as a problem, typically you have a gap in ABC. And here's how you should correct that gap. And so do you want me to go and spend all that time gathering the data? Or do you want to move forward? And most of the time, the response is, okay, that makes sense. Let's proceed with your recommendation. So I think data is great, but too much of a good thing can also become a bad thing, I think, sometimes. So I like to say data should inform your decisions, not dictate them. So much of HR is science, but it's also sense making. And the best decisions happen when you use the data to sharpen your instincts, but not replace them entirely.
I love what you're saying about that. For HR people and HR executives, again, who are early on in their journey of using people data, what kind of hiccups, challenges, or bumps do you think they will experience as they start going to executive decision making table with data? And how can they navigate those hurdles that they are going to encounter? Because they might not be as data fluent or data savvy to make that judgment call on, am I going to lean heavily on data, or little bit is good enough for me, because that is a good indicator to support my pitch to my executives around what I want to push for.
I think so. The first thing that I do whenever I come into a new organization is I actually have a conversation with the CEO and the CFO, and typically the chair of the HR and compensation committee of the board, to understand how they think about HR data, what dashboards have they been looking at, or what metrics have they been looking at in the past, what are they interested in seeing in the future, how do they want to see recommendations presented to them. So I kind of set sort of informal norms or rules of engagement with them. And I find that conversation to be incredibly helpful to sort of set the stage and set the tone for how are we going to manage all of our people data, and how are we going to leverage it to make decisions, and how do you want me to come to you and present recommendations. But the other pitfall that I see, which we sort of touched on earlier, is just throwing up dashboards on the screen and not really telling a story. And this is not just an HR problem. I've seen finance people do this too. So I'm not going to just pick on my colleagues in HR. But I think that one of the best ways in which you can solidify and strengthen your recommendations is through storytelling. So a dashboard or metrics tell you the what, and that's not sufficient. I think the next step from there is you need to explain the so what, i.e., the business implications. So these are the metrics. This is where we stand. This is the what. This is the so what. If we don't correct this, this is what it means for the business. This is what it means for our ability to attract talent, to retain customers, to acquire new customers, to launch new products, etc. And then you need to take it a step further and talk about the now what. So what are we recommending? What are we, HR and whoever else is involved, recommending in terms of next steps? And this is where HR needs to come to the table with a recommendation or a point of view. You may not end up implementing the exact recommendation that HR came with, but at least you give the CEO and the HR committee or the board at large something to react to. When people have something to react to, it's much easier to spark a conversation or a debate about what to do next. So I think for HR leaders who are new or newer, I would encourage them to think about the what, the so what, and the now what. And if you think about your data storytelling in that way, that kind of easy mental model should ensure that you come to the table with a solid recommendation.
I love that framework, because starting with what, especially like what matters most to the decision makers, is so critical. Otherwise, I've heard so many stories. I'll share one with you where this people analytics team, very passionate, was collecting ENPS data on their survey. And they were noticing a trend with ENPS data. But when they took the ENPS data to the CEO, it sounded like, based on what my conversation with this particular person came out to be like, was that the CEO didn't really care about the ENPS metric. And here the HR team was like so excited, so proud, so passionate about figuring out what's happening with the employee population, and our promoter set is going down and detractor set is going up, and also did root cause analysis of what could be the reasons for that pattern change. But it didn't matter to the CEO. I mean, so much so that the CEO came back saying ENPS doesn't align with the culture of our organization. So there was so much time, energy, effort gone in make sense making around a metric that wasn't important. I'm not saying ENPS is not important. It's just a situation that I'm flagging, linking to what you're saying about understanding what the leaders really want to solve for first, what matters to them.
You're making such a great point, because context really matters. right? Your business context really matters. And I think that another common mistake is kind of copying and pasting your dashboard from your old company to your new company. It may or may not work because, to your point, your new CEO and board and executive team may not care about the same metrics because the context of the business is entirely different. ENPS is such an interesting metric to me because so many companies track it, and ENPS tells you the what, but it doesn't tell you the why, right?
Right.
Unless you create a custom survey and add additional questions to measure the why, or unless you follow it up with focus groups or skip levels or other stay interviews or other kind of mechanisms to gather additional data. So I find ENPS to be an interesting metric, but I also see a lot of organizations kind of misusing it. The other thing I will say on this is it's important to be aware of leading indicators versus lagging indicators. You and I have talked about this before. In the HR world, you might look at things like turnover, and turnover is a very important metric. And you should look at the different data cuts like turnover by team, by geography, by tenure, by function, et cetera. But turnover in and of itself is a lagging indicator because once someone has decided to leave, it's already too late. You can't do anything about it, especially in the case of regrettable voluntary turnover. But if you want to look at leading indicators, you might look at employee sentiment analyses or engagement surveys or some of the things we said earlier, AMAs, skip levels, focus groups. So I think it's important to strike that balance also between leading and lagging indicators, and to educate the board and the CEO on leading and lagging indicators, because if they haven't been educated on what leading and lagging indicators are in HR, they may not even know. And in my experience in small to mid-sized businesses, most of them don't understand what lagging and leading indicators we should be looking at in HR.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. And I would also, based on our conversation, now I'm thinking that ENPS is just one example, but there might be some indicators that a CHRO or the HR executive team might need just for themselves to understand what is the lay of the land, like what's working, what's not working for everyday decisions that you have to make as an HR team. And not everything has to be bubbled up to the CEO either around employees. So maybe there has to be a balance between what are the indicators and data, what's the data picture and indicators that I'm collecting for myself so that I can be more effective, and what do I need to kind of take to the rest of the broader executive team and for what kind of decisions. What's your point of view on that?
I think you make a very important point. There are some things that I think are very important to track over time, and I kind of keep an eye on them. And if it starts to feel like there might be a problem here, then you surface it, right? So one of the things that I often look at is in most engagement surveys or pulse surveys, you might have some kind of question that says something like, we hold people accountable for their performance,
Mm-hmm.
something along those lines. And I think that is a very important question to look at. So often we talk about what top performers want, right? They want competitive compensation and benefits. They want development and growth opportunities. They want access to the executives and stretch opportunities. They want to feel seen and heard. But what not enough people talk about is top performers want to work with other top performers. The worst thing that you can do to a top performer is make them clean up the messes of the poor performers on the team. It's the quickest way to lose engagement with them and to lose the plot. And I like to look at that question around, are we holding people accountable for that reason? Because if it starts to trend in the negative direction, then likely what's happening is you're probably on the verge of burning out your top performers, because often they're going to be picking up the slack for people who are not pulling their weight. And it may also indicate a manager or leader effectiveness problem. So if leaders are not holding people accountable, maybe they're not having meaningful feedback conversations, or perhaps there's a conflict avoidance issue in the organization. So that question can be indicative of a lot of problems within the company, and it can directly impact the performance of the enterprise. if you're not holding people accountable. So that is one that I like to keep my eye on and surface it if it starts to trend negatively.
From your point of view, why is it even more important today, given what we are going through with AI bringing seismic shifts to the organization? And how can a mature people analytics practice be a superpower for a CHRO and their team?
So, as we know, AI is going to start to play a bigger and bigger role in how we run our businesses, how we make decisions, including how we make talent decisions, how we acquire talent, how we promote people, all of that, right? Here's what I found really interesting. So, I was listening to the Gartner podcast recently, and they were talking about I think it was the 9 top HR trends for 2025. And one of the things that they talked about is they found in a survey that they asked a question to people that said something along the lines of, I would trust an algorithm to give me fairer feedback than my current manager. So they weren't asking about, would you trust AI or an algorithm to give you feedback? They specifically asked, how do you think about comparing an algorithm to what you have right now, meaning your current manager? And only 13% of employees disagreed with that statement. I would trust an algorithm to give me fairer feedback than my current manager. A third of the respondents outright agreed, and 50% were neutral. And so I think that that tells us, the way that I interpret that is not kind of this widespread enthusiasm for AI. What that tells me is, in fact, there's actually a widespread distrust in the current state of affairs when it comes to leadership effectiveness. People, for whatever reason, don't trust in their organization's ability to manage performance appropriately. And this is very consistent with other data we've seen. So in another study that I read, only 2% of Fortune 500 CHROs agree that their performance management process is working as intended. So why am I talking about this? Coming back to your question about AI, if we are going to start to use AI and algorithms to make or at least inform people decisions, then we need to ensure that our data house is in order, that we have the right data, we are capturing it and using it appropriately, and obviously we are compliant with all of the regulations, but also that we are creating a culture of transparency and trust so that employees, to your earlier point, understand what data is being captured, why is it being captured, how is it being used, which career actions is it affecting, or outcomes is it affecting? Is it affecting my compensation, performance score, promotion, etc.? And there needs to be explainability. So not just a kind of black box algorithm that's spitting out deterministic outcomes or recommendations, but how is it probabilistic versus deterministic? How is that information being used to manage my career within this organization? And so I think that is why data, and people data specifically, matters, because it's going to come down to, are we creating trust with our employees, and do they actually understand how their efforts lead to outcomes, whether it's rewards, promotions, etc.
So, which touches on the digital experience aspect of employees as well. And in our previous conversation, you talked about the CHRO becoming co owners of the digital experience. So, in that situation, what kind of data should organizations be tracking so that they can augment those digital experiences, whether it's my career progression, whether it's my day-to-day performance feedback, whether it's my coming back from mat leave and reintegrating back into a work environment? I'm just naming a few experiences that can be digitally augmented. Where do you see data evolving that picture? Because yes, the research that you talk about is talking about a performance, but I am sure that if we pulse our employees about what does the current state of nation look like from an holistic employee experience perspective, there's a lot of room and opportunity for us to improve it. So with data, solid data foundation, and the capabilities that AI provides to us, how do you see that digital experience changing and evolving in the future for employees?
This is such an important point, because for all intents and purposes, the digital workplace is the new workplace, right? We used to gather in offices to do work, and now we gather on the internet to do work. And so the digital employee experience is absolutely paramount. The way that I look at it is I don't even think that there is any one answer or formula here. I think we are moving in a direction of extremely personalized employee experience. So the way that your customer journey is super personalized, you go on Amazon and you order a book, and then it'll give you recommendations based on what you've ordered in the past, or it'll tell you people like you who ordered this also ordered this, right? And I think that's where I hope we are moving with employee experience. I think it's going to be very, very personalized, and I think it could look completely different for every individual and every team. So in your example of, someone who is expecting, someone who's going to be a parent, if they go on your company intranet and they look at the parental leave policy, perhaps the AI agent or assistant might say, hey, people who looked at this parental leave policy were also interested in the childcare benefits. Would you like me to serve those up to you now? Or someone who is tracking their skills in the internal talent marketplace might be served up recommendations on which roles might be interesting to them. So, for example, Workday a few months ago announced their succession agent, right? So you might have an agent that is actually helping you as a leader look for successors in different parts of the organization that you didn't think of. And as an employee or an applicant, it might help you think of positions where your skill set might be transferable that you might not have thought of in the past. So I think a lot of this, I hope, will become very, very personalized. And I think we will begin to track employee experience journeys from onboarding to offboarding. And obviously, every journey is going to look very different. And so, in every case, we might start looking at, okay, what was the cost of acquiring this employee, and what is the employee lifetime value? So, organizations like Culture Amp are already talking about this idea of tracking employee lifetime value, just like we track customer lifetime value. And creating that comparison between acquisition cost and employee lifetime value. So I think that metric, very, very individualized and personalized to each employee, probably might become the gold standard. I hope so. That would be an interesting world.
It totally will be. I'm just curious to know your perspective on this because when we are imagining the future state of how employees are taken care of in an, I would say, work context, the experiences they have may look and feel very different from what they're experiencing today. So for HR teams, should they be waiting and watching for these product platforms to integrate AI into their product suite and then lean on them? Or should they be thinking about building internally? Or should they start thinking about imagining a future state and how they add value to the organization first before any of the other approaches? What's your take on this?
I think we need to resist this temptation of slapping the AI sticker on things and calling it a day. I think it's important to start first with what is the business need or business problem we're trying to solve. So if you are in an organization where your volume of hiring is extremely high and you need to bring in a lot of people very quickly, but you also need to ensure quality of hire, then you might think of either building or buying capabilities around AI agents that can help you with talent acquisition. Met with a company recently, which is a recruiting firm operated entirely by AI agents. The founder, and then it's a bunch of AI agents, which could work very well in a high volume recruiting environment. But you might have a different problem if you are an established organization and you are about to go through a major enterprise-wide transformation. And actually your biggest problem is you need change management capabilities, you need transformation capabilities, you need to bring your leaders up to speed. You need your middle managers to be able to translate the strategic vision for this transformation and translate it into execution rigor at the front line level. And you need employees to jump on board. So the problem that you're trying to solve there might be completely different. And so I think it's important to understand what problem are we trying to solve before figuring out, do we build, buy, or bot? And some of it also comes down to, how much capital do we have access to? I imagine the larger organizations that are sitting on tons and tons of capital will have the ability to invest in building their own AI solutions, because not only do they have the financial resources, but they have the risk appetite sometimes and the time to build an experiment. But a small to medium sized business, if you have revenue less than 700 million, your EBITDA is less than 100 million or 200 million, you may not have the time and the financial resources to build your own. So you might go out and try to buy something that's off the shelf or slightly customizable. But I do think it's important first to start with what is the problem we're trying to solve, and come up with interesting use cases that your people will want. Most seasoned employees are not looking for AI to help them draft an email. They've got that covered. What they are looking for help with is the monotonous, tedious part of their job. The part of their job that is taking up a lot of time and cognitive resources and not creating much value in return. So I would say that's where we should start by focusing first.
Well, what a great place to put a pin in our conversation today, because in our next episode, we are going to do a deep dive on designing future ready organizations and the HR AI playbook. So that way we can dive and build on to where you're leaving us with problem first mindset and approach to solving for AI. Before we wrap up our conversation today, Malvika, is there any one last piece of advice that you would have for HR leaders who are thinking about maturing their people analytics and data capability that they should be doubling down on as they mature their practice?
I would say the key is to tie your HR and people data to business outcomes and to use data as a storytelling mechanism, not just as a way to throw up dashboards on the screen and expect your executives to make sense of them. And also keep in mind when you're looking at data, whether you're looking at leading or lagging indicators and how they might affect the business's ability to deliver what it needs to deliver.
Fantastic. Malvika, thank you so much for helping us reframe how we think about data, not just as information, but as a tool to drive impact, influence, and insight.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, if you are an HR leader wondering how to earn a seat at the table, it might start with speaking the language of the business and use data as your dictionary. Join us next time as we explore what it means to design organizations of the future where human potential and AI innovation truly meet. Until then, keep learning and keep leading.